That thing cuts off real quick. So, all right, I've got a new computer here. Hopefully, I don't get a whole bunch of notifications because, well, you know what? Actually, all this is connected, so I can just do that. There we go. It should, yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, you're getting some people.
Yeah. All right. Good evening, everyone. We are live with Dr. Grady McMurtry, and I don't know if this is actually going to work. Let's see. Nope, it didn't work because I haven't connected all my Stream Deck sounds. So we're just going to go yay as if we had all the sounds connected. An honor to have you back with us, sir. I was going to try to have Rod Saunders in here, but I didn't get a chance to link up with him and talk questions. So I'm going solo on this one. So big love to Brother Maynard in the comments. Caps, I think my mom said she's online and folks are coming in. So if you would just give us a quick synopsis before we really dig in, Dr. Grady, share just a little bit of your testimony, your background, and how you from 0 to 60, how we got here.
Oh, I go 0 to 100. Now, I was born and raised as an evolutionist, earned my science degrees as an evolutionist, but at the age of 27, in a search for truth, I became a Christian. And a search for truth is what a good scientist ought to do. A good scientist does not seek knowledge. A good scientist seeks truth. And so at 27, in that search, I became a Christian, but that made me a saved evolutionist. And I had a big problem. So I spent 16 months looking at the science fresh, not allowing what I had learned and taught others, what I had previously believed, to influence me, sort of a blank piece of paper. And I looked at scientific law, natural process, physical evidence afresh, and came to the conclusion that there is absolutely no science to support evolution whatsoever. It is simply a fairy tale for adults. It's a house of cards. And at that point, I became a biblical scientific creationist, someone who believes 100% from the Bible, 100% from science. The creation is true, occurred approximately 6,000 years ago. It was a lot easier to say back in the year 2000. But in 6 literal days, as we experience today. And I have spent the last 50 years going around the world. Uh, as you know, I've been to Brazil over 20 times, and we'll be back there again very soon. But I also this year have been to the UK. I've been to Kazakhstan. I usually make 3 or 4 foreign trips every year, though most of my work is domestic here in the States. But I teach on creation versus evolution. I teach on biblical inerrancy, of course, sharing the gospel. And I am a full-time teaching itinerant missionary.
Now, how many times have you been to Russia again?
I was in Russia 59 times. Now, I got out 2 days before the invasion of Ukraine 3.5 years ago. And because of the political situation, I'm unable to go back, although I would love to. I was in Kazakhstan earlier this year and was able to teach students in the Russian language because, of course, at one time it was part of the Soviet Union. Not the children, but the adults usually speak not only Kazakh, maybe English, definitely maybe Russian. And so my students were Russian speakers this year.
Mm. And were you able to go to Russia when it was still the USSR, or did you only start going
I
after?
didn't go. I didn't go that early. My first trip to Russia was in July of '94. I've been going then, like I said, 59 times, twice, sometimes 3 times a year since 1994. But July, November, and then I changed to November or February. It was simply more advantageous for the ministry's purposes. And like I say, on a few occasions, I went 3 times a year. So it ended up being 59 times. And I would dearly love to make it 60. But at this time, that's not possible.
I
By the
miss.
way,
Go ahead.
no, all I was going to say, by the way, if we do have anybody out in the audience that speaks Portuguese or speaks Russian, if you go to my website at creationworldview.org, the site is in 3 languages, and you'll see little flags up in the upper left-hand corner. If you see the Brazilian flag, you hit it, and it will turn the site into Portuguese. or if you hit the Russian flag, it will turn it into the Russian language. We have free articles, we have free short videos, and we have a bookstore that's available to people if they are interested in resources.
Nice. I'm trying to show this on screen for everybody, but it's like I said, new computer. Okay, so you mentioned.
Are you sure it is an old operator?
Well, I did turn 45 a couple years ago, a couple weeks ago. I actually
A
just
couple of years
ago.
ago, right?
But 45 is still young to everybody that I tell I've turned 45, and they're like, "You're still a baby." So
Well, I would think of that. I'm 78.
yeah, so you got a little while on me. So you mentioned the 6,000 year creation.
Hmm.
Can you give us? Let's. I definitely want to spend. So my goal before the end of the interview is to arm everybody with at least 1 to 3 hard, fact, easy to remember responses for evolution, for creation, and especially for those that would maybe, I don't want to say argue or debate, but maybe discuss with other believers that are bought into theistic evolution as to why these things
Right.
don't jive with the biblical with the Bible, just period. But why does the fossil record support creation and not evolution? Can you give us just some of like your hard and fast, just top
Well, yeah, of
five?
course, that's only one of many, many topics that we could talk about when it comes to the age of the earth, biblical inerrancy, etc. The Bible should, of course, be our first authority in all things. And the Bible clearly says to us, for instance, the genealogy of Mary in Luke, that the genealogy only goes back about 6,000 years. However, when it comes to the science of it, the general subject is called geochronometers. Geo, like Earth, matter, universe, and chronometer, time clock or time recording mechanism. And a geochronometer simply is a scientific argument proving that the Earth, the galaxy, the universe are young, in fact, only 6,000 years old. And there are today roughly 450 scientific arguments. Now, you mentioned particularly, let's take a look at the fossil record. Now, we could take a look at astronomy, we could take a look at geology, but when it comes to the fossil record or paleontology, um, people are taught in school there's layers in the ground, sedimentary rock layers. They're taught that there are fossils in the layers. Now, I grew up in the paleontology laboratories at the University of California, Berkeley, which is one reason why I was an evolutionist. And in the textbook, it shows a nice, neat, clean order from shellfish at the bottom and young, small organisms living in the water, finally ending up with man at the top. And it shows, well, the dinosaurs lived at this time and the fish lived at that time and so forth. Well, of course, there's always been fish, so to speak. There's always been ocean water organisms. Um, but that all looks good on paper. It looks good in the textbooks, but there's only two places that it does exist on Earth, and that is in the textbook and in the minds who believe in evolution. The fact of the matter is that when you go out and dig in the ground, and I would challenge people, when did you go out of the ground and check to see whether they were telling you the truth or not?
Mm,
I simply accepted it. I was naive, thinking that my teachers would never lie to me. But of course, the truth of the matter is, teachers will lie to you right and left. So when we take a look at what's in the ground, we have sedimentary rock layers. There are fossils in many of them in places and some not. But first of all, what are sedimentary rock layers? Well, they're dried out mud.
hmm
So there are two ways of looking at those layers. One is called historical geology, and that is the evolutionary view. But you can't find that in the ground. Now, the layers are there, there's fossils, very true, but they're out of order, they're upside down, there's backwards, but there are other inconsistencies as well, such as many layers are folded and sometimes highly folded, often perpendicular to the ground versus horizontal, they're vertical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how did those wet mud layers laid down by water, because water would lay it down horizontal, how did they get to be vertical? And yet they're not broken. Why don't we find soil horizons between the layers? Why don't we find V-shaped erosion marks in the layers? Why don't we find root holes, and why don't we find animal holes, burrows, for instance, in them? Because if they did accumulate slowly over a long period of time, we should find those four things.
Yes.
And what people find there is not consistent with this historical geology. We find polystrate tree trunks,
Going
although
through the layers.
technically,
Yep.
well, a tree trunk that penetrates, polystrate meaning poly, many layers, strata. Um, but they often they'll have no roots, they'll have no tops, they're just logs. So they will penetrate more than one layer. You've got to ask yourself a question: how could these tree trunks have been buried in a flood or floods, as the evolutionists would look at it? How did they live for, quote, millions of years without tops or bottoms while these mud layers formed around them and turned into rock? I mean, totally inconsistent. In fact, sometimes we find them upside down. So you got to ask yourself a question: how did it grow upside down without tops or bottoms for millions of
For
years while
millions
these
of
layers formed
years.
around them? So there are many other inconsistencies as well. Actually, most fossils are technically polystrate. Um, Really, you almost have to get down to single-celled organisms before they can't be called a polystrate fossil. So a skeleton can be polystrate, and often are. We find, of course, many of these fossils in very fine, thin layers, individual layers, but very thin, a millimeter or less thick. And so the skeleton is actually penetrating through many layers when you get the layers that small.
Yeah.
Um, but again, the truth of science is often determined by what is missing, not what's there.
Mm.
So in good science, you ask yourself two questions: what is there and what is not? And so you ask yourself what is there, and you have to adequately, accurately describe what's present. But then you also have to be able to accurately determine what's not there. And so often what's missing is more important than what is there. And so, as I mentioned, when you see hundreds of layers, but there's no soil horizons in between, that tells you that there was no time in between deposition, that they all were deposited at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So the alternative view of the record of the various sedimentary layers in the ground, whether there are fossils there or not, it's called flood geology. And so you have to remember, everybody in the audience ought to remember, that creationists and evolutionists have the same physical evidence. You know, here's a fossil of a dinosaur. Well, yeah, we both have a fossil of a dinosaur. The question is, how did it get there? And of course, how old is it, etc. So in flood geology, we take a look and we realize all of the inconsistencies with a slow and gradual accumulation, again, upside down, backwards, whole mountain ranges. And I can show you pictures of them, whole mountain ranges that are upside down. It isn't just a question of a layer here or a layer there. We're talking about entire mountains of it.
Mm.
And so that tells you that this was not laid down in a slow, gradual accumulation over long periods of time, the historical evolutionary view, but it was in fact laid down at 1 year by a worldwide flood. And the evidence is far more consistent with that than it is the historical geology.
Yeah, and I heard somebody interviewing somebody on a podcast, and I actually meant to clip it, where they were postulating rather that it may not have been a worldwide flood; it would have been just a worldwide cataclysm. I guess trying to make excuse for that possibility of that meteor that hit over there in the near the Yucatan Peninsula, so it may have caused local flood, but also, just things being reported in different parts of the globe, which I'm like, well, how in the world does that jive with what
There's only two views: either it's slow and gradual, or it all happened at one time.
yeah.
You can't make anything else work. Again, now you can believe anything you want, but that doesn't make it true.
Yes.
And what might seem plausible or might seem logical, again, doesn't make it true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know about you. I want to deal in facts. I want to deal in truth. And so when I take a look at the physical record, I can also take a look at simply the geology. And those people who want to talk about asteroid hits, such as the Yucatan you mentioned, the fact of the matter is, of course, the evolutionists used to teach this old story about a meteor so big it hit the Earth and caused so much dust to go into the air that we had uh, a winter from the dust, like volcanic winter or nuclear winter. Simply isn't true because we have now found fossils of dinosaurs above the KT layer, showing that they didn't all become extinct because of the KT layer. The KT layer is not consistent all the way around the world. Now it's there, you can find it, but it isn't consistent around the world, and we have found fossil dinosaurs above it. So again, they weren't all wiped out by it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this old story simply doesn't hold water, and many evolutionists know that and have stopped teaching it.
Yeah. Yeah, I also thought it was interesting that when he was talking about this global cataclysm, he said, it couldn't happen from water just raining down. I'm like, did you not read the scripture? It says the fountains of the deep burst, and he just never even mentioned it. I'm like, I had to not even pay attention to what he was saying. I'm like, you're not even addressing what the word says to
Over
address.
99% of the water came from below, and it was put there by God on day two. If you read the scripture very carefully, it says on day two that now there was water on the surface from day one,
Mm-hmm.
but we're talking about a relatively shallow layer of water. We're talking about less than a kilometer, um, less than a mile. But God created a mile thick layer or 1.6 kilometers. I'm trying to work both English and metric for you here. Um, but when he says he put the waters below and the waters above, this is when he put a layer of water underneath the earth. This is 10 to 11 miles down. And it was 1 mile thick, basically. And people will ask, well, where did you get those numbers? Well, I can prove those numbers. And we have found the remnants of it still down there. There's still 5 to 10 times the amount of water in the earth that there is on the earth. When we say that the earth is the water planet, it is seriously true. Now, most of that water is not in layers, most of it's in between particles, but we have found vast layers of water. There's an entire sea underneath the Gobi Desert. The problem is it's too far down to get to, but it's there. We found it using remote sensing, primarily through the sound waves created by earthquakes, is how we determine a lot of that. But much of that layer never came out the first time. It's still coming out today, slowly, gradually, through volcanic activity, black smokers, mineral hot springs. And it's coming up at roughly a cubic mile or 4 cubic kilometers per year. And it's called juvenile water. But that's water that didn't come out the first time. And so the 40 days and 40 nights of rain that's written about in the Bible is really insignificant to the flooding of the earth. It would not have raised sea level more than 3, maybe 4 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the vast amount of water came from below. And I have a presentation, as you know, called The Waters Cleaved.
Mm-hmm.
And in there, I show that, in fact, we found the layer. We know that since that layer came up at the time of the flood, the fountains of the great deep, the springs of waters burst forth, broke open, or in Hebrew, the waters cleave, that they knifed through from below. Um, we can prove that by taking a look at three-dimensional maps of the world without water. And so in the Indian Ocean, you'll find two continental shelves. One's a mile deep, and then it breaks off, goes another mile deep. Same thing is true in the Pacific, from the Gulf of Alaska to Kamchatka, along the southern edge of the Aleutian Islands, also from Kamchatka down past Japan, Vietnam. There are two continental shelves because as that 1 mile of water came up from below, then the ocean floor had to drop a mile because it was no longer supported.
Mm.
And it broke off, leaving double continental shelves in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. So it's hard to obviously without visual show people, but hopefully I'm describing it adequately well. And Gabe, I hate to ask and stop for a second, but can you put a S between my first and last name for my initial? Um, I say that because, believe it or not, there are other Grady McMurtrys out there, and the S in the middle helps people to know it's me.
Oh, on the live stream in general?
Yeah, right in the live stream.
Oh,
The
gotcha.
bar you got it.
Yeah, I can do it after the fact. Yeah, so you want me to put Grady S. McMurtry, right?
If you would be so kind.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'll do that after when we wrap up.
And again, creationworldview.org is the website for those that might be looking for
Yep.
it.
I had that pull that up on the screen.
Thank you.
I'm putting it up there every now and then, and it's also in the comments so people can click on it.
It's appreciated. I do. So hopefully the word pictures that I'm describing for folks will help to give you the concept of what the Bible does say. And then on day 3, God caused the land to rise up out of the water and creates the dry land. And therefore, I would also point out that the evolutionary story of Pangea does not belong to the evolutionists, it belongs to us. And that is described on day 3 of the week of creation.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact of the matter is that the Bible accurately describes the geology of the earth. It describes the catastrophic destruction of the surface, particularly if you go to Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9. That's the chronology of the flood. And that chronology is absolutely consistent with what we find. And the person who wants to talk about cataclysm, that would really come from 2 Peter chapter 3, because Peter does say that there will be a judgment in which the earth will be cataclysmically cleansed by a judgment by fire, but the flood is a judgment by water. And
which he said he's not going to do again because it was pretty.
Which he promised that he would never do again. What some people call the rainbow promise after the flood. That's not really accurately correct. But he does promise that he'll never again flood the entire earth with water. But we will all agree that the earth has actually experienced thousands and thousands of floods in the past. But the 1 year long flood described in the Bible, that God prepared in Genesis the water for the flood, that in Psalm 104 he describes it coming out as well. And the fact that the water covered the mountains, this is not local, it's global, that when the water goes away, after that, then the mountains rise up and the valleys sink down, and he'll never again flood the earth with water, which is consistent again with what people call a rainbow promise covenant with the earth. It was a unilateral covenant with the earth. But that cataclysm in 2 Peter has nothing to do with flood or sedimentary rock layers, etc. And so people have to distinguish between them as being quite different.
Yeah, I would think so. Here's a comment / question. Wouldn't the fact that we have floods today prove that that's not what that promise was, or that's not what that flood was? And if you have sea life, fossils of sea life on the top of Everest, which is the highest point on all the globe,
which you do, we have fossil seashells on top of Everest.
Which would that not prove that it was at one point underwater? Which if it was,
well, it proves that what's at the top of Everest was at one time underwater, but has been pushed up, over thousands of years. But again, that is described in Psalm 104, verse 8, that the mountains rose up and the valley sank down.
Mm-hmm.
And the folding, the mountains, which are clearly showing us folded layers, are certainly that process of the uprising of wet mud layers then being folded by tectonic forces.
Mm-hmm.
And I have marvelous pictures from mountain ranges all over the world, on all 5 continents. I've not been to Antarctica, so I can't say 6, but the fact of the matter is there are mountains down there that you could show it. But this proves that these layers were wet when they were folded. You cannot fold rock, it will break. You can only fold mud. And so the layers had to be laid down, and while they were still wet, then folded by tectonic forces, and then dried out into hard rock. And so
I just threw up a link for the Waters Cleaved. It's only $15, y'all. It's an MP4 video presentation. Get it.
Thank you.
It's good for you. But wouldn't that also go back to going back to the to creation versus old Earth? Because if that happened over millions of years, how on the, and or billions of years, and life didn't happen until a few 100,000 years ago, or millions of years, how in the world did you get sea life on the top of the mountains up there above?
Well,
That's
again, it
what
had
I'm,
to be pushed up.
yeah,
And again, the Bible accurately describes that. That's the important thing there.
yeah.
Um, but there are many other geochronometers that tell us it's all young. As a matter of fact, there are scientific arguments that prove that not only is the Earth young, but the Lord has to come back soon too. And so when we deal with the inerrancy of Scripture, every scientific statement in the Bible is accurate. Period. Now you may not understand it, but it is accurate. And if you have a struggle, you can always contact people like us to help you with it. Okay.
Chris Capps has a good theory, since you
Yeah.
mentioned Pangea not but a few seconds ago. So Pangea, is it a theory,
Yeah.
or was there a Pangea landmass and the biblical flood created the separate continents?
Well, the wording is a little off, but let me go back again to the
Yep.
creation week. On day one, God created the earth with a layer of water on the surface. Day two, God creates a layer of water down below, as I mentioned, 10 to 11 miles down, roughly a mile thick, containing millions of cubic miles of water. And he added some moisture to the atmosphere, which those of us who live in Florida find almost impossible to believe, but he did. Now, that moisture, of course, much of it came down during the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and we still have plenty of moisture there. But when you take a look at day three, now this is difficult, I know, trying to put this together on a program like this. But on day one, when God created the earth is slightly egg shaped. It is wider than it is tall. And um, the Holy Spirit started the rotation of the earth in verse 2. The word, when it says that the Holy Spirit was moving over the surface of the waters, is an agricultural term for the way a chicken broods an egg. And so I want to get you to kind of think in terms of, first of all, eggs. All right. Now, in verse 3, God creates light. But in verse 2, God, the Holy Spirit, like a chicken incubating an egg, he starts the rotation of the earth. So a chicken creates the egg by laying the egg, and then she warms one side, and then she rotates the egg. Well, in verse 2, God the Holy Spirit starts the rotation of the earth, just like the chicken rotating the egg and energizing the systems, incubating the egg. He's incubating the earth. Then in verse 3, God creates light. And now he doesn't create the sun, moon, stars till day 4, but God doesn't need them. He can simply speak light into existence. And so the earth is egg shaped, it's rotating. You have days, each rotation is a day, just like today. And then day 2, the waters below, preparation for what will occur at the time of the flood. What I try to get people to do, though, is in the margin of their Bible on day 3, it says that God caused the dry land to rise up out of the water. So think in terms of, and I'll try to do this, think about the bowing of eggshell out of the water. And it says he separated the land from the water. What do we have? If you looked at the Earth from a satellite at the end of day 3, you would have seen 40% of the Earth's surface dry land and basically together. Now, we do have the evidence for some islands. Today they're called Gaias, but there were some islands. But basically, most of the dry land was in one place, what is called Pangea. And he gathered the water into one place, so the land's in the other place, that's Pangea, with the exception of the few islands. At the time of the flood, when the waters knife through from below, it breaks Pangea up into big pieces. We call them continents. And because they are floating on a layer of water, they can slide away very quickly. Think about a boat and a dock. It's very easy. A child can push a boat away from a dock if it's floating in water. And so the continents can move very quickly in only one year. But as the water's coming out from below, there's less and less water holding the land up. And so, again, we're going to have the formations of the oceans by the dropping of the ocean floors. But in addition to that, as that water continues to come out, eventually the continents can no longer slip or slide. They simply lock down into place where they are today. And that's why we have thousands of miles, say, between South America and Africa, North America and Europe. Um, People say, well, they look like they would fit together. Well, yeah, today they look like they would fit together, but you're looking at where sea level is today. When I show you the continents without water, then you'll notice that the continental shelves do fit together, some places perfectly. There's a place in Brazil and a place in Africa where the fit is absolutely 99.9% perfect. The Forgive me for saying Argentina. We please forgive me. Uh, but if you take a look at the Earth with no water, the continental shelf off of Argentina on the Atlantic side has a hook shape
Mm-hmm.
underneath the Falkland Islands that perfectly fits between the east side of South Africa and Madagascar. And again, perfectly fits on the west coast along the coastline of Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil. You can clearly see that. But you can also see that the Grand Banks off of Canada perfectly fit into Europe. You
Yeah.
can actually see that Antarctica at one time perfectly fit against the south coast of Australia. And there's a double continental shelf there too, by the way, if you look carefully.
Yeah. I've seen those maps, and they're shocking how you're looking at puzzle pieces just.
Oh yeah, exactly. See, that's just it. I tell people, when you put a jigsaw together, where do the pieces fit? At the edge, right? So when you take a look at the continents, you don't want to look at where sea level is today. You want to take a look at the edge of the continental shelves because that's the edge of the jigsaw pieces. So you've got to remove the water and think about why don't evolutionists want you to see the Earth without water? They want to show you the continents. They may show you a political globe with just lines for countries and states and provinces. They might show you a topographic globe where you can see the mountains and the valleys, but the water is almost always blue. And why don't they want you to see the bottom of the ocean? And it's because if you could see the bottom of the ocean, you'd start to ask questions they don't want to have to answer. You'll see the actual evidence of Noah's flood.
Yeah. And those knife marks that you were talking about, to imagine that happening in real life, in real time, is that would make an amazing
Well,
horror film, you know.
the,
It really
well, in one sense, that's true.
I mean, seriously, man, we have these catastrophe films. I'm like, you guys have never done anything like that. And I never bothered watching the Russell Crowe Noah film because it was so.
Oh, that was atrocious.
Did you
That
watch it?
that was such no. Well, I saw some clips. I saw some clips, and it was just gross. I
Yeah.
mean, the misrepresentation of the Bible was quite intentional. I mean, they were trying to throw Christians under the bus and farces and so on.
Oh no, they threw
It's
him under the bus and rolled over like with like 8 tires, and then took off again.
yeah, no, that movie was just plain trash. You know, but there have been other movies that have tried to show the end of the world and an ice age type of thing, um, which has given people just total misunderstanding of an ice age to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
There's been animated movies and non-animated movies about an ice age and the end of the world. Truth of the matter is that the Earth did have one ice age. It occurred right after the flood. The events of the flood would cause an ice age. It really wasn't that big a deal. Probably lasted somewhere around 700 years or so. But even the ice age of the Earth, even evolutionists, if you would push them a little bit, would agree that in an ice age, the ice doesn't go to the equator. Brazil, um, Africa, the whole continent of Africa never had ice glaciers. Now there's glaciers down at the south end of South America because yes, the ice shield that today covers Antarctica did at one point in time cover the very south extremity of South America, but it's much further south than Cape of Good Hope. But again, if you think about it, that the glaciers basically came to the Canadian American border, slightly down into the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, the Laurentian Shield area. But the terminal moraines are not much further south than the Great Lakes. I have personally been where the ice stopped between St. Petersburg and Moscow. Now, Moscow is about as far north as the south end of Greenland.
Hmm.
And so while Scandinavia was covered, Iceland was covered, Greenland was covered, Canada, much of it, not all of it, but much of it was covered with the ice from the Ice Age. There were plenty of places where it just came only down to the Canadian US border. There's much of Siberia that was never glaciated.
Hmm.
Um, People tend to think, and believe me, I went to Siberia many a time in February. If you think it's cold where you live, you ain't seen nothing yet. Where I used to go in February in southern Siberia, it was minus 40. But northern Siberia was minus 70. And
What?
if you go to northeastern Siberia, up in the mountains there's a place where every year it gets down to minus 100.
Isn't that like Antarctic levels of cold?
Antarctica is the coldest spot ever measured, but the coldest spot continuously is in the mountains in the northeast corner of Russia, which is called, actually not Siberia. Technically, it's called the Russian Far East. But up towards Kamchatka, there's a mountain range, and that's the coldest consistent area, even though a colder temperature has been measured in Antarctica. Antarctica is not as cold, typically.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's plenty cold.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that even in the areas up in Yakutia, where it does get to minus 70 in the winter today, that was actually never glaciated during the Ice Age. Now, it was glaciated in the mountains of the Urals that separate Asia from Europe. It was in those mountains that I just mentioned. There were glaciers, but most of Siberia was not. I mean, we find, yes, frozen mammoths, sure. We also find frozen hippos and frozen rhinoceros, which are hardly
Yeah.
cold weather creatures.
Yeah, that's and that's actually something I know from my studies that was the consensus I'd seen, that the ice age happened right after the flood. But I actually never considered how far down it possibly could have gotten, and obviously it couldn't have gotten everywhere. You don't get off a boat and, okay, well, the dove brought you a branch. That how in the world did it get a branch from? No. And this is the problem that we have today, is we have to parse the little bit of truth, the nugget of truth, and then, okay, now what's the Bible saying? How does this actually make sense? Because there's just so many lies out there.
No, Noah and the family never saw ice. They were
A
kept
lot of water
nice and toast. They were kept nice and toasty and warm by some very warm water underneath them and around them.
and a bunch of warm
Where
animals.
where they landed wasn't glaciated. The first mention of ice and snow is several places in the book of Job. Now, Job is a factual person. There's a great deal of science that's totally accurate in the book of Job. In
It's the most
fact, God
scientific
gives
book in the
Job,
Bible, isn't it?
well, it's the most science after Genesis.
There you go.
But
Yeah, yeah.
but be careful about calling it the oldest book of the Bible.
Oh, no, no, no,
Now,
not the oldest. The most scientific book is, yeah.
well, it has tremendous amounts of science in it. And of course, when God shows up, he gives Job a science test of 77 questions.
Mm-hmm.
I have offered to get anybody a PhD in any university of the world, including Moscow, Sorbonne, Oxford. If you can answer all 77 questions accurately and completely, I'll get you a PhD there. No questions asked. I've been studying this now for 75 years. I can only answer some of the questions inadequately. And I got 3 doctorates, so um, but the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of science in Job, but there's a lot of science throughout the Bible in places. There's some great sections on, God's the creator in, say, Isaiah. But the fact of the matter is that we're not here to talk about how much science there is, but the science that's there is factual. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
Now, the first mention of ice and snow is in Job, and Job is 350 years or so after the flood. The ice age that was generated by the flood, for very good reasons, only lasted about 700 years. So Job is living in roughly the middle of the ice age. And that's the first mention of ice and snow. But Noah and the family never saw it. The people that stayed at the ark while they were still there never saw it. It was only later when people came from the Tower of Babel, because from the Tower of Babel, people do go north, and they start seeing ice and snow as they go north, but would not have seen it prior to that time. And just so everybody understands, what was the causation of the ice age? Well, the water down below, 10 to 11 miles down, is a temperature of between 900 and 1,000 degrees. As you go into the earth, it gets hotter. And there were warm seas from creation, from the creation week. And when that hot water comes out from below, some of it mixes with the warm water that were already in the seas and will now give us very warm oceans. And so you've got very warm water. Well, the warmer the water, the faster it evaporates. So you're evaporating a lot of moisture into the atmosphere. But when the earth, when the water knifes through from below, there's the crack, as you've seen in the maps I've shown. But there's also the kickoff of tremendous volcanic activity around the world, that thousands and thousands of volcanoes all went off at the same time. And so what happens? Well, that pushes ash into the atmosphere. Now, we have historic proof of this. When you go back to Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, it cooled the Earth 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit in 1 year, because the ash, Pinatubo is very close to the equator, but the ash blocking out sunlight, blocking out reflecting heat, cooled the atmosphere. Now, it didn't cause an ice age, but it caused the atmosphere to cool. When you go back to historic volcanic eruptions, Krakatoa, the sound heard around the world, we know had a cooling effect because of the amount of ash. But if you go back a little further, and you go back to another volcano in Indonesia, which is again very close to the equator, it caused the year without summer. So one explosion of one volcano, the ash went into the atmosphere so great. This is Tambora, the volcano Tambora. When it erupted, it put so much ash into the atmosphere, we calculate roughly 80 cubic kilometers of ash. It cooled the earth so rapidly that the next year there was no summer. It snowed in all 12 months of the year in Europe that year. So when Tambora erupted, it proves that just one massive volcano, and it's not anything compared to the super volcanoes that occurred after the flood, such as I'm sure you may be familiar with Yellowstone, the super volcano at Yellowstone. But Crater Lake in Oregon is another super volcano that erupted after the flood. Those volcanoes put out such a massive amount of ash that it's unfathomable. And because of the ash in the atmosphere, it cools the atmosphere. So now you've got cold air. You've got very warm water in the oceans that are evaporating a lot of moisture, and you have the perfect conditions to create an ice age.
How many of those super volcanoes would have had to go off for 700 years? A dozen, a couple dozen?
Well, first of all, thousands of volcanoes went off.
Yeah.
Now, the super volcanoes, there's at least 3 super volcanoes in the western part of the United States.
So just on this side of the planet.
Oh yeah, I mean just in the continental U.S.
Wow.
But in addition to that, you've got thousands, and you've got the Ring of Fire, which you're quite familiar with. Everywhere that the major plates meet, which is where the water's knifed through from below and cause the continents to come from Pangea and move to where they are today.
If you've got
massive amounts
paying attention, he's putting it all together. Be paying attention, y'all.
And so we have the perfect conditions. Now, those volcanoes put a tremendous amount of ash into the atmosphere. But of course, eventually they calm down and they eventually go quiet. And so what happens then? The ash starts to precipitate either by gravity or by snow, etc. There's a very interesting passage in Job that talks about the storehouses of the snow.
Mm.
Well, think about it for a second. You've seen snowflakes, and technically no two are identical.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about them, they do look a little bit like a sieve or a colander because there's air spaces between the fragile crystalline structure. And as snow comes down, it actually does sieve the air and brings the particles that are in the air, which include nutrients, down to the ground. And so the storehouses of the snow are simply the nutrients being trapped in snowflakes and being brought to the surface. As you know, nitrogen fixation with thunderstorms, that the grass is greener after a thunderstorm because of the nitrogen that's created in the thunderstorm.
Mm.
And so, simply to point out that eventually the snow comes down, brings all that with it. But as the ash is coming down and the atmosphere starts to clear up, then more sunlight starts to come in and the earth starts to warm up again. Now, we weren't there. I'm talking about best guesses, really. But our best guess is, and the ice age is not instantaneous because it has to start, it has to get going.
Yeah.
But once it gets going, that it probably peaked about 500 years after the flood. But then again, the volcanoes stop, the ash comes down, the heat comes in. And then the polar ice caps, which had formed during the ice age, during the first 500 years or so, well, what happens is they melt back to approximately where the glaciation is today. So actually, when we take a look at geology, it fits perfectly with the biblical account.
Mm. That is incredible, Doc. I want to go back to when you mentioned, and actually, I don't think I asked this in person when you were in here in North Carolina. I think because you didn't either I missed this night or you didn't talk about it this night. I wanted to talk. This is actually something from watching your stuff just incessantly over the last, I don't know, 7-8 years.
Bless you, my son. Live long and prosper.
Hey, yeah.
Hey, hey.
Give you a nice Levitical blessing there.
Yes, I can do it with both as well.
There you go.
Practice, practice, practice.
You mentioned, I think, 13 fallacious assumptions for radiometric dating, because when you mentioned fossils and finding the fossils through through the layers, and I'm like, well, can I just get and Ken Hovind talks about this. He just asked the question, when was it lit? If you walk into a room, you see a candle lit, you have no idea how, and ask somebody
How it's burning. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the easiest?
It's interesting, Gabriel. Here, have you say 13? Okay, all radiometric dating processes have 6 fatal false assumptions.
Gotcha.
But carbon 14 actually has 20 plus. So I don't know where the 13 came in, but that's okay. It doesn't matter.
All right.
It's always interesting.
So it's 13, get you 19, then you just add one for good measure. You did one.
It's what you hear versus what people remember. I just. But all of them have 6 fatal flaws. I don't care what it is: carbon 14, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium, uranium, lead. It doesn't matter. All of them have 6 fatal flaws, and the very first one is obvious to anybody. I mean, anybody just listening would know that the first one, and not, as long as they're not indoctrinated by their teachers to not even be able to think. Evolutionists don't want people to think. They want followers. They don't want thinkers. But we have very sophisticated equipment today, mass spectrometers, all kinds of stuff. We can accurately determine the amount of isotopes in a sample today very, very accurately. But the problem is you don't know the starting conditions. You see, they assume the starting conditions to get the dates they want, but they are assuming the starting conditions when in fact they don't know them. And when we change the parameters, it changes the age, you know.
Yes.
And of course, I have some lovely examples that I show. I have a whole hour long video on the fallacies of carbon 14. I have a whole long hour video on the fallacies of the potassium argon method. Um, and in there, I also include some samples in our age of the Earth and our geochronometer presentations and so forth, where we use the method they want to use in the same location and come up with hugely different dates. You know, we watched Mount St. Helens erupt on Sunday morning, 1980, May the 18th. So we know exactly when the lava flows and the cinder cones and so forth from that eruption and the six subsequent eruptions as well. We know exactly when they were dated. People were there, they saw them, they documented them, etc. But when you use the potassium argon method, which is the one typically used on volcanic materials, it's the eruption that we saw happen in 1980 has been dated at 2.6 million years ago and that kind of thing. The Hawaiian eruption in 1801 put a lava flow from the top of the volcano all the way down to the ocean floor, 2.6 miles. You can follow it. It's one continuous flow. There's no question about it. It was documented, it was witnessed. And yet we sent a robot down the side and took various samples, and you get everything from 0 million years old, which would be technically a correct number for potassium argon, to 12 to 21 million. And yet people watched it in 1801. These methods don't work. And the assumptions that give them the dates they want, in reality, a knowledgeable evolutionist doesn't bother to use radiometric dating technology because they know they don't work.
Yeah.
What they do is really they date the rocks by fossils and the fossils by rocks. It's a circular reasoning. And the truth of the matter eventually becomes they date the rocks and the fossils according to their religion. And that's really what it ends up being.
Woo!
There's no modern technology that can accurately date anything beyond modern written records. And again, there's a huge difference between published dates and the dates they actually got. That is to say, that they will test a rock until the rock's worn out, trying to get the date they want. And then they select that one because it's the one they want, and they throw the rest away. And they will take again samples, and they'll get what they call outliers. Now, so you have a chart, and you have these radiometric dates because of the decay of radioactive materials. But then you have a one that's over here and a one that's over there, and they say, well, they don't count. Well, I got news for you. In science, we're supposed to deal with data. Now, those outliers are data. So when you throw them out, you're making an arbitrary decision not to use the data, but to use your religion.
Mm.
Now, as a scientist, I'm highly offended by evolutionists because they're not honest. They are totally deceptive. They are lying through their teeth. They are showing you what makes them look good, and they'll publish the dates they want, but they won't tell you how many they threw away or how many they tested till they got it right. There's a wonderful classic story on this. Dr. Richard Leakey, anthropologist, is the guy who found the skeleton typically known as Lucy,
Mm.
afarensis. So, Australopithecus afarensis.
That's it. Yeah.
Um, Now he found it, and there was a material, some ash above the just right above the where the fossil bones were found. Now you got to remember Lucy's only 20% complete. 80% of it was missing to begin with, but uh, he can't date it because that would just be his opinion. So he's got to go to a quote expert, a fellow evolutionist who uses radiometric dating processes. And he says, okay, I need you to authenticate how old this fossil is because if I give you it, it's just my opinion. But I need your, professional date to publish. And they kept dating it way older than it could possibly be for human evolution to be involved. until they finally got a date he liked, and they just threw the rest away and published that one. They retested that layer until they finally got what they wanted. Well, that's not honest. That's not data. That's religion.
Yeah. Chuck Missler used to say, torture the data long enough until it tells you what it wants, what you want it to say. And I think that was he was quoting somebody
Yep.
else.
I believe he was, but nonetheless, it's a valid comment.
Yeah. Yeah, it always makes my skin crawl when I hear the big, the big personalities on the internet, like Joe Rogan bring up Lucy, and I'm like, oh, I wish
Well,
he'd have
but
you
Joe
on.
Rogan, yeah, Joe Rogan, he's grew up and been taught evolution, so he thinks what he's saying is right,
Yeah.
and so you know
Well, I
I
mean,
understand that.
Nebraska man,
I did
young
this.
man.
Well, I did the same thing. I did the same thing was I when I was growing up as an evolutionist. I parroted what I was taught because again I didn't think my teachers would lie to me. But I
Mm,
found out that they will. They'll flat out lie to you. They'll try to support a lifestyle that they want to live, um, and it's an anti-God lifestyle because we are all born with the Adamic sinful nature. And yeah, I mean, I wish Joe Rogan would have somebody like me on too. And if you can arrange it, I'd be very happy to go on his program. The fact of the matter is, we need to fight with truth.
hmm Well, we Rod Saunders and I we did a live stream a couple weeks ago discussing Wes Huff's kind of ministry explosion, and he actually commented on one of the places where we put it. So he was just on Rogan. So who knows? Stranger things had happened. Stranger things have happened. So I'd love
You
to
get me an
see.
invitation, no way.
Listen, if he gave it to me, I'd be passing it right off. I'd be like, no, man, there's other people you need to have. There's more important things. And though I'm not afraid to share my testimony, I'd rather somebody like you go over there and be able to shine a light on all this craziness. We've kind of gone through some of the first things that I wanted to discuss, which is the truth about carbon dating and the age of the Earth, which you said, I'm pretty sure it's you. It might be Ken Hovind because you guys basically nail this point that if anybody says something was radiocarbon dated older than I think it's 250,000 years, you just laugh at them because it can't be
Well,
used for
well,
anything.
first of all, that's a theoretical limit. In theory, carbon 14 goes to zero in 250 to 350,000 years. Um, but carbon 14, again, the dating process has 20 scientific flaws. It doesn't work, um, even in recent cases, so to speak, such as just dating the flesh of frozen mammoths, which certainly are only a few thousand years old. You get horrendous numbers. Um, it doesn't work. The only thing that carbon 14 is good for is dating the age of the Earth as the Earth being young.
Mm,
Because when
it's
we
younger
take a look at
than
carbon 14,
yeah.
the most sensitive instruments that we have today, now the theoretical limit being 250, 350,000, but our instruments today cannot measure beyond 17 and a half lives. So to put that in a number, that's roughly 103, 104,000 supposed years. Um, so the reason that carbon 14 is only good for proving the Earth is less than 6,000 years old is because we can't find any carbon deposit on Earth that doesn't have a significant measurable amount of carbon 14,
Mm,
proving that it must only be a few thousand years old at most.
mm,
Because if the Earth were even 100,000 years old, we should find, again, various carbon materials. So coal, oil, natural gas, carbonaceous clays. We shouldn't find any carbon 14 in them, and yet we do. We're say just go out west to the coal basins in Wyoming, and you've got anthracite coal there that they would tell you is 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, and yet it has measurable carbon 14, which proves it can't possibly be. That these are simply materials that were laid down during the flood of Noah, roughly 4,350 years ago.
mm-hmm.
Um, Same thing with oil, natural gas, carbonaceous clays. And so science proves the Earth is young, that the universe is young as well. And you wanted some really good arguments. You wanted 2 or 3 points. We talked about the fossil record. We talked about the sedimentary rock layers and all of the inconsistencies, which are far more important than the consistencies. I would point out again that experiments done at Colorado State University, also at a sedimentation laboratory in France, have proved that the layers do not form one on top of the other uh, in flowing water or in vacuums. That in fact they all form at the same time. So that the layer at the bottom is the same age as the layer on the top. And again, these sedimentation labs are not creationists, they're evolutionists. But Colorado, because they have such magnificent mountains and flat plains, and sedimentation is a big issue out there, Colorado State has a huge sedimentation lab. And another one similar to that, a friend of mine, Guy Berthaud, did the experiments in France. But it proves that the layers all form at the same time and extend in the direction of water flow. So the age of the layer at the bottom is the same. So what happens? My hand is inadequate, but it's like a diagonal plane at the front, and the layers form behind the diagonal plane, but the one at the bottom is the same age as the one on the top. So that position doesn't determine anything about age.
Mm. I almost want to go into this next one, but I have to ask.
For it.
I have to ask this question because science, in watching this and watching debates and guys like Dawkins and stuff, and they're losing so much ground. Do you see are many scientists starting to abandon Darwinism? I mean, are
Oh
they
yes.
being,
Oh yeah. The honest ones do. It's the dishonest ones that don't. And I would point out, God taught the modern scientific method in the book of Job, the first 3 chapters of Job, 4,000 years ago. The problem is that people forgot it. And it was only 400 years ago when the we'll call more modern day Christian creation believing scientists basically rediscovered the modern scientific method. But no evolutionist designs an experiment believing that evolution is true.
Hmm.
I mean, think about it. Evolution says that everything is random. Well, you cannot design a scientific experiment on a belief that everything is random. I mean, if you think about it, evolutionists believe that if you plant tomatoes, you'll get corn. Um, so scientific experiments are designed very, very carefully, And then what we do is we do the same experiment a second time, but we change only one parameter. So everything is very tightly controlled. But evolution is totally random. And so the fact of the matter is that no evolutionary believing scientist designs an experiment on the basis that evolution is true. They have to use the modern scientific method, which comes from Christians and from the Creator God, taught again 4,000 years ago in Job. They're using that method. But what happens then is when they get results, because they are evolutionists, they have to spin the results to try to say that this result proves evolution is true, when in fact, if you really take a look at it, it
Proves the opposite.
Yeah.
Or they tortured the data long enough to get the outlier.
Well, it's kind of like if you torture a human being, you can get any answer you want to. But the fact of the matter is that they're not using science. Evolutionists gave up using science decades ago. If you really look at it, you're going to find out that the modern day evolutionist doesn't use science to prove evolution anymore. What they use is a legal proof.
Mm.
And by that, what I mean is the legal proof is where you have evidence and you take it into a courtroom and you have lawyers. As you know, many cases we could cite going on just this week, but you know, but each lawyer on both the defense and the prosecution side say, here's the evidence, here's our story, here's our spin. Because again, it's just like science. We have the same evidence. Here's the bloody glove. If it does not
I was
fit,
going
you
to say,
must quit.
right?
Right?
If the glove don't fit, that's the first thing I thought of when you said that.
Which was an absurd statement. I mean, Cochran really spun a story on that one.
That was some great lawyering.
Well, he's dead now, and he's found out that he's not the best of lawyers. But the fact of the matter is that there's a good reason the glove didn't fit, regardless of the dried blood. But that they have their fairy tale, they have their story, they have their spin with that evidence, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then the jury theoretically decides. But in the legal methodology that evolutionists want now, they have their evidence and their spin. And as long as you listen to them, it seems right. Now, that comes straight out of the Bible. You know, the first guy's argument sounds great until you hear the second guy's argument. Then you realize there are flaws in the first one. And that's a biblical statement.
Yes.
You know, you'll find it right in the Bible.
Yep.
Um, but here's the thing, in the legal method, you have the evidence, you have the lawyers and their spin, but you also can have a witness, right? Now, it is theoretically impossible to get a capital punishment case based on one witness, one eyewitness, because that person could just not like you, could be lying, correct? And that's why the Bible says, let it be established in the mouths of two or three witnesses.
Yeah.
So, in a capital case where you're dealing with murder and a person losing their life and that kind of thing, if there's only one eyewitness, you might get life in prison, you might get 10 years or something like that, but you cannot get a life death sentence without at least two witnesses, and for very good legal reasons. Now, when evolutionists attempt to use the legal method of proof to prove evolution, you know, here's the evidence and here's our spin. Again, it might sound good to the easily deceived, but we have the evidence and we have our spin, but we also have a witness.
Mm.
And that's why they lose every time.
Mm.
I mean, think about it for just a second. One of the things that I became a Christian in a search for truth was when I read the Bible for the first time and realized that the Gospels are legal depositions. They're four different eyewitness accounts.
Mm-hmm.
You can take the four Gospels into a court of law and establish the existence of Jesus Christ because you've got four witnesses. Now, there's about a dozen historians that are accepted as good historians that also mention him too in the
Yes.
past. So you have the four Gospels that we have in the Bible, but you also have a dozen solid historians that talk about him too.
Mm-hmm.
So his existence is not the issue. Who or what he was is the issue. Um,
And
but we have the Bible.
it's really
We
just
have the
about the
witness.
resurrection.
Yes, and the fact the single greatest thing for me was when you can read that over 500 people were willing to die on a cross, which is a horrid death, and would not recant having seen him after the resurrection. And to me, that was the single greatest piece of evidence that the resurrection was true.
Mm.
I mean, we can read the eyewitness accounts and you can believe it or not believe it as your choice. But when 500 plus people are willing to die on a horrid, horrid death um, and would not recant that they
Yeah.
had seen him physically after the resurrection, it is absolute proof of the resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Because who would be willing to die for something that they knew was a lie?
Well, you see, that's just it. No one will voluntarily die to support a lie. Now, there have been a lot of people who involuntarily died to support a lie.
Mm-hmm.
My classic example there is that during World War II, there were German soldiers who were Christians, you know, born again, saved Christians, going to heaven, um, but died to support a lie of the Nazi regime. But they didn't do it voluntarily.
Yeah.
They did it
Meanwhile,
out of coercion.
most of the high command got out of town and went to Argentina. So what did they really believe?
Well, maybe not as many as some say, but certainly some did. There's no question about that.
Yeah. I mean, of the
They did know
highest of the guys in the highest.
or Brazil, I might add
Yeah,
too.
exactly. Yeah,
They went
exactly.
to South America, where there was Colombia. It just, but there were those that were able to get out, and those that weren't.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, those that committed suicide, those who died, etc. But my point being is that there have been good people who died to support a lie, but they didn't do it voluntarily.
Mm-hmm.
They were coerced,
Yes.
just as Rommel committed suicide so that his wife and children wouldn't. have to die. That was the deal with Hitler, was that he had been a part of an attempt to kill Hitler because he wanted to end the war, etc. And he was a field marshal of tremendous capability. But he agreed to commit suicide so that his family wouldn't. So it was coercion. People also forget how many Christians, German scientists, came to the U.S. and helped to do things like land on the moon. Wernher von Braun was not only a Christian, but he believed in a young Earth, young universe.
We're gonna have to do a whole other episode on him. I didn't hear. I've always heard he was a Satanist.
Oh my goodness, no.
Oh, that's okay. That's
when the war was near its end, and I'll just throw this out for you.
Yeah.
When the war was nearing its end, and the Allies were coming from the west, and the Russians were coming from the east, Wernher von Braun held a prayer meeting at Peenemünde, and the scientists prayed that they would be captured by the west, not the east. Now, there were plenty of German scientists that got captured by the Russians and taken into Russia and enslaved into various activities. Of course, the German scientists who came to the West were allowed to work freely. But von Braun, because of his work with the V-2 rockets and so forth in the 30s and then in World War II, was then involved with our NASA program. But he was a Christian and believed in a young Earth. Back, and I have to say now, probably 35, 40 years ago, I was doing a presentation series on creation. And at the end of the series, and I had done a presentation about young Earth and those kind of things, and the lack of dust on the moon, for instance. And my wife and I, when I was getting my master's degree, we had watched the original landing on the moon in black and white, 19-inch screen. And we actually watched the original landing. And of course, we're picking up dust, and you can see dust blowing around, and then it simply went thud, right? Well, Dr. von Braun believed that the Earth was young, the universe was young, but he had evolutionists working for him who believed it was old. If you take a look at the lunar landers and the mock-ups or the photographs, etc., you'll notice that the ladder was 18 inches too short. This is why Armstrong and Aldrin had to jump down, because they were convinced. I mean, that's why you had those umbrella pad legs. They were convinced
down into
it was going to. And we didn't want it to be a suicide mission, but there were NASA scientists, evolutionists, who believed that it was 4.5 billion years old, and they'd be at least 300 to 30 feet, whatever. And so they put those big lunar lander legs with those, again, umbrella pads, and the ladder was too short because of the weight. You may not realize this, but at the time of the lunar landers, back 69 to the 70s, it took 10,000 pounds of rocket fuel, equipment, etc., to put 1 pound on the moon and get it back. So cutting the ladder 18 inches short was a conservation of weight. Many people don't realize it, but the walls of the lunar landers were so thin, you could have pushed your finger through them. They were that thin. And again, to save weight. Well, this elderly gentleman came up to me after the presentation. I have no reason to believe that he was lying. He said he was a technician working for NASA at the time of the space program going to the moon, working under Dr. von Braun. Now, he was just a tech. He wasn't a scientist, but he was a tech there. But he was in the room when the lander hit the moon, and von Braun, he said, broke out laughing because he was right and the other guys were wrong.
You want to bet? I'll bet you $100 that it does not sink.
Just don't lift your right hand, okay? But it simply shows that a good scientist who follows good science and does what I did, which is seek truth, in my opinion, if they're allowed to live long enough, will become a Christian.
That's powerful. Well, the truth is staring us in the face every day. We're above ground all around us.
Well, and you wanted people to have a couple of arguments. Now, first of all, we talked about the fossil record and we talked about the layers in the ground and so forth. But um, most people are not necessarily going to be adequate from education to talk about fossils and sedimentary layers and polystrate fossils and so forth, though they may. And I hope they did pick up some of what we talked about. But some of the single strongest arguments for a young Earth and a young universe would be things like the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, which proves
That's,
beyond a shadow of a doubt.
I was going to get to that.
that-
That was my favorite of yours.
Oh,
That's your favorite. It's
it's
indisputable.
my favorite. It's my favorite. It is indisputable. Today, there are roughly 450 scientific arguments for a young creation. I think it's number one, if not, it's in the top 10. But the decay of the Earth's magnetic field proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Earth is young, and indeed the solar system is young too, um, and proves that the Lord must be coming back soon.
Mm-hmm.
Because without the magnetic field, we all die.
From radiation
And
and
it's
things
from
coming
radiation, because it is a protective shield.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to go back 8 to 10,000 years, the magnetic field would be so large. It has a very short half-life. It has a half-life of 1,400 years. It's incredibly fast. But if you go back a mere 8 to 10,000 years, then the Earth's magnetic field would cause every cell in your body to be ripped to shreds. They'd wipe you off the wall after an MRI. And if people think, well, you're lying to me or you're exaggerating, think about CERN. Think about the super collider in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on using super magnets, because if you're going to control a beam of electrons and protons and so forth, you have to, for miles, and put them in a beam, very tight beam, and have them collide into each other, etc. The super magnets are incredible, but no human being can be in the tube when they're on, because again they would die. So even if you just think about the experiment at the super collider, you know that I'm telling you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
When you get an MRI, they don't hit your body with anything close to the force of the magnets that are used in the super collider. But the Earth's magnetic field, if you were to go back roughly a mere 10,000 years, and I say mere because to an evolutionist that's nothing.
Yeah.
But if you go back even to a mere 10,000 years ago, um, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field would be that of a magnetic star. Well, life doesn't exist on
Whoa.
magnetic stars.
Say that one more time, Doc. You gotta say that one more time. I heard it, but I didn't hear it. Hold up. One more time.
Okay,
How strong is it?
if you were to back up, okay, so it has a half-life measured at 1,400 years. We've been able to measure it for 200 years. We have an extremely good idea of the half-life of the Earth's magnetic field. It's decaying just like a radioactive material, a half-life of 1,400. So when you go back in time, every 1,400 years, you will double. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. If you go back 6,000 years to the time of creation, the Earth's magnetic field will be 20 times stronger than today. That's not an issue. That's okay. You can survive that. But again, if you go back 1,400 years and then 1,400 years and you are doubling again, you go back a quote mere 10,000 years, and the Earth's magnetic field would be equivalent to that of a magnetic star. So people who believe that evolution has been going on for millions and billions of years are obviously not scientists. They are theologians of a false religion called secular humanism.
Woo! Clip that. That's the short right there. Holy cow. Well,
Oh,
not
but
holy
I
cow.
got but I got others. Well, sacred cow.
Yeah. You're-
Let's not go for the red heifer. I don't want to go there. Uh, but
Somebody buy this man a steak. Try the veal. He'll be here all week.
thank you. Uh, the laws of science disprove evolution. Period. The first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law tells you the universe cannot be the reason for its own existence. That it had to come into existence whole, complete, at one time. That it could never have been anything less than it is. That's the first law. The second law tells you everything's going downhill.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why the universe cannot be eternally old. So again, that tells us that evolutionary philosophy, religion, is false. but I like to use this one. The Earth's magnetic field, my number one. If we go much longer, we lose the protective layer. If we go back thousands of years, we all die. Evolution cannot have been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, etc., because that time never happened.
Yeah, it couldn't
Okay,
happen.
couldn't happen. But again, we take the second law of thermodynamics, which applies to everything, including the speed of light. Many people want to say it doesn't, but it does.
Mm-hmm.
The second law says everything in the physical universe decays over time, and that includes light speed.
Added to entropy.
Um, but the word entropy is the measure of the loss.
Gotcha.
You know, so entropy is the measure of the loss in a system. But it's the second law is that everything goes downhill. Well, the same thing is true of our DNA. And the biggest thing today to throw at an evolutionist, who's I say a biologist or in the biological sciences, is genetic entropy. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have not been here for very long and we can't be here for a whole lot longer. You know, people, that old joke about the government budget. In the government budget, we used to talk about millions of dollars. And so, you talk about enough millions of dollars and you start talking about real money. And then they started talking about billions. Well, today they're talking trillions. You
Which
know,
we
a
can't even
trillion here, a
fathom how much.
trillion there.
Yeah,
Oh,
we can't
you
even
can't.
fathom how much money that is. People don't know. We say it so flippantly.
Well, and the human mind really can't conceive in the terms of billions. I mean, we can talk about it. We got an idea. We can talk about it knowledgeably in the sense of using those terms. But a human being cannot really contemplate a billion. But the joke now is a trillion here, a trillion there, and you start talking about real money, right? Well, I love going to England. And I've been to England many times doing mission work over there. I was just there in March of this year, as a matter of fact. And they have this wonderful expression. I like going to England because they actually speak English. Here we don't speak English; we speak American.
American,
It's a
yeah.
dialect. But they have this wonderful expression. Let's do the maths. I love that expression. Let's do the maths. And what they're saying is, let's do the mathematics, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wish people would just do the math, just the arithmetic. You don't have to know calculus.
Mm.
You don't have to do derivatives. Uh, you know, simple, basic mathematics. Tell me something. How long is a generation today? A human generation. Well, today a generation is roughly 20 years. I mean, you can find a woman that's a grandmother by the time she's 38, right? I mean, that's all the time, right?
Yes.
But the Bible talks about generations in terms of 30 and 35 and 40.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but just do the math. In 6,000 years, there has been approximately 250 generations. Now, of course, people were living a lot longer, reproducing for a lot longer initially, etc. But just wherever you are right now, you are approximately the 250th copy of the original Adam and Eve. Okay. Now, when you copy something, which is what genetics is all about, we copy the previously existing information, pass it on into the next generation in new combinations,
Mm.
but never new information. We copy the previously existing information, pass it on into the next generation. And genetics is a process of copying the previously existing information and passing it on into the next generation in new combinations, which is why we say a child, well, he's got his his mother's eyes, his father's chin. I mean, whatever. Um, because it's a recombination of previous existing information, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the study of genetics totally destroys evolution. Totally. Because you cannot copy more perfectly. You can only copy perfectly, in which case there is no change. It's simply a duplication.
Yeah.
Or you can copy imperfectly. And the word mutation is the scientific word for imperfect copy.
Mm.
Mutation is a copying error. Now, you, I, everybody listening, watching, etc., is approximately the 250th copy from the original. The truth is, we ought not to even exist.
Yeah.
Think with me, if you were to copy something, even using machinery, after 250 copies, you've lost information, you've scrambled it up, etc. And so mutations lose, mess up previously existing information. And we have a great creation scientist who's a double doctorate in biology, who took a look at all known cataloged mutations in plants, animals, people.
Mm-hmm.
He found at that time approximately 1.5 million known documented mutations.
Wow.
Particularly with fruit flies are a great example of that. I mean, we can do things to flies that are illegal, immoral, and unethical. Um, there's one that everybody loves to do. They take the fruit fly and you can do this, force it to do this. It'll have 100 eyes on its body. They're not functional. They're not attached to anything, but they're there,
Yeah.
which is defined as an accidental duplication of previously existing information. It's a mutation. It's a copy and error. And again, we can get flies with crinkled wings and extra wings and no wings, and that classic joke about what do you call a fly with no wings? A crawl.
Yeah.
Um, but these are mutations. That's a loss of previously existing information,
Mm-hmm.
or an accidental duplication of previously existing information. And I have seen snakes and turtles with two heads, and I've seen cats, dogs, cows, deer. I've seen all kinds of things with two heads, or five legs, or six legs, or four ears instead of two, and
Yeah.
some things I don't even want to discuss
Yeah. Human
because
beings with
they
extra
don't
limbs.
live long.
Yeah.
They don't live
Yeah.
long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Very common, with cats which have six or seven claws instead of five. Um, but that's an accidental duplication of previously existing information. There's nothing new there. There's nothing, no novel information. Um, so in genetics, we copy the previously existing information, and we either do it correctly, perfectly, or we don't. In which case, we lose. We scramble up previously existing information. And so, after 250 generations, we ought not to even exist. Now, God, in His foreknowledge, knew that this would happen. And so, what did He do? Now, in our human DNA, we have approximately 3 billion bits of information. It's like a computer storage device. And in that 3 billion, he pre programmed seven little genetic engines, machines, that go up and down our chromosomes every day, every cell, correcting the mutations that occur in every cell. Every cell of your body has 1,000 to 1,000,000 mistakes per day in copying information.
Hmm.
And so, if you don't correct this information loss or corruption, we would cease to exist. Well, the same thing is true of our reproductive information. It is also true of our genes for intelligence. We are not getting bigger, better, faster, smarter. We're getting smaller, slower, and dumber.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a fact of life.
Go to TikTok. There's your proof right there.
Well,
I just made you depressed.
anybody, anybody that goes to TikTok to get any information is lost as a goose in a high wind. But the fact of the matter is, we're losing information from every generation. We know since April of 2003, when the Human Genome Project was completed, we know we are losing 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation.
Wow.
So if there's been 250 generations, now see, here's the thing. The mistakes originally were very minor, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like a snowball going downhill. So we aren't losing 1 to 2% every generation going back to Adam and Eve. But today, because of the snowball going downhill,
Mm.
because the mistakes aren't getting corrected, we are now losing 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation. And if that continues, what happens? Well, first of all, we are losing our intelligence. Now, I'm talking individually here.
Yeah.
Now, people will say, yeah, but we know more now than we ever have. True, I agree, but that's because the unique characteristics of humans outside of animals is that we can accumulate knowledge and pass it on into the next generation, which adds to it. So, from a total standpoint of information, we have more available now, but that's for 6,000 years of accumulating information over time. But individually, we are getting less and less intelligent per generation because we're losing the genetic information in the intelligence genes. Well, the same thing is also true in our reproductive genes. Now, I don't know how adult the audience is, but anybody ought to know from even open source information, males are getting less and less fertile. That's just the way it is. And it's because of this genetic entropy. Well, what happens is when you lose enough of the genetic information dealing with our reproduction, we become sterile. Now, when you become sterile, you become extinct.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it isn't going to take, now, I'm not talking about tomorrow. I'm not talking about next year, not a decade or 2 decades from now. But in hundreds of years, should humans continue to exist, we become sterile and we become extinct. And that's true of all life forms, everything. And so evolution cannot be true because genetics does not allow new information to occur at a higher level of intelligence or complexity to come into existence by random chance.
Yeah.
And everything we see in science is that it is all in a process of decay. And we cannot have been here very long, and we cannot be here much longer. And that's just good science. So when people talk about, oh, the sun's going to burn out in a billion years or whatever, you ain't got to worry about that long.
You'll
Believe me.
not be here to see it.
You won't. And that's why the Lord must come back soon. Now, the loss of the Earth's magnetic field, the loss in genetic entropy, these are scientific arguments that proves that not only is this all young, but the Lord's coming back soon. And I put that in quotes. Okay.
Yeah. Well, soon is a relative
Because
term.
the Bible tells us that there are going to be people here to greet him when he returns, whenever that is. And so people cannot become extinct. Therefore, it has to be relatively soon.
That's good, Doc. That is so good. I've got one question so far, and everybody's really enjoying this. One of our brothers that's been with us for a while. He's actually a few minutes behind. He had something happen with his internet. He had a question when you were talking about the electromagnetic strength. He said he's 2 minutes behind. Where's your question, Brandon? Oh, there it was.
The electromagnetic of the Earth, a star, is what I was asking about. Well,
yeah. Would this be proof of a geocentric universe? I think the strength. No. Okay. All right. You want to give him a short explanation as to why?
Well, first of all, the heliocentric, geocentric was disproved long ago. And the story of Galileo and the Pope and all this jazz is not being taught correctly. It's like the story of Columbus is not taught correctly in history textbooks. It's revisionist history. The fact of the matter is that while many people did think it was geocentric, that goes back to the astronomy of Ptolemy. However, the church at the time of Galileo, and we'll call that the year 1600, approximate, so people know the rough time period. When Galileo discovered the telescope and was actually able to make some observations of the heavens, the church accepted the geocentric view simply because it was accepted around the world and it came from Ptolemy and so forth. But the church had absolutely no problem whatsoever with accepting the heliocentric view. That's not why Galileo was put in house arrest and why he had a falling out with the Pope, etc. And so the church had no problem with the heliocentric view whatsoever. And of course, various science has proven from Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, other astronomers of real note, that the heliocentric view is correct. But it wasn't a big transition for anybody. It was just a lack of knowledge, and a lack of knowledge is curable. Stupidity isn't.
I've never heard that one. Hold up. The lack of knowledge is curable. Yep. But
It
stupidity
is.
isn't.
And again, I stress, if you're not willing to learn, you'll never be willing to change. Well, the church was willing to learn, and the church changed, and it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
But Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and these early astronomers, and we could go on to others like Herschel, um, and you want to get even closer, men like Hubble and so forth. Um, it wasn't a problem going to the heliocentric view.
Okay. Rod Saunders, he jumped in, I think, about halfway. What's up, brother Rod? He wants to know, what if we colonize Mars? Do you think we actually have a chance of colonizing Mars before we go
Well, first of
extinct?
all, well, before we go extinct, now that's a question. The fact of the matter is, humans can do this. You know, there's two things though. First of all, why would you want to do it? Secondly, what's the cost?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we went to the moon at a tremendous cost back in 69 to 72. Um, and of course, we've had various space probes, not humans, but various probes go back to the moon. And now they want to colonize the moon. Why? Because it would be a great way to get to Mars, etc. My first question is, you know, what would it take, just time wise, to make a round trip to Mars? Well, it takes basically 3 years. It takes about a year and a half out and about a year and a half back, and that's if you only stay for 2 or 3 weeks. You know, we're not talking about colonizing. But you've got to remember the surface temperature of Mars is very close to freezing, has very little atmosphere. You have to live in your spacesuit or live in a sealed building. Um, I would like to compliment in a sort of way. If you saw that movie, The Martian, that is one of the better scientific movies, science fiction type movies, of how he survived for a year, and it shows how cold it is, and it showed that when his greenhouse exploded, that everything froze. I mean, there was a lot of good stuff in that movie that was really good science. The only thing in that movie that really was not, and what made it real science fiction, was the storm that caused him to be left behind. Storms like that cannot happen on Mars. That's the total science fiction thing. So you had to buy into the storm for the plot. But once they did the plot, there was a lot of good science about what it would take to survive on Mars. But that storm is total fiction because Mars doesn't have enough atmosphere for that kind of a storm.
Gotcha.
And if you think about all the pictures you have seen from the various rovers that have been or are still on and operational on the surface, you've never seen a storm like that in any of the pictures. You've seen a lot of red, and you have, of course, night and day because of the rotation. But you've never seen a storm like that because it would be impossible on Mars to have a storm like that.
Hmm.
But you had to buy into the premise for the rest of the movie. But there's a lot of other good stuff that was really, really good in it.
Hmm.
But colonizing Mars, why bother? It gets into human ego. Yeah, we can do it, and if you spend enough money, you can go and you can, etc. The people who have signed up to go on a one-way trip, though, I think are insane, in a polite sense. Now, um, however, I have a really good question. Do you know how many satellites we have sent to the moon, either to orbit it or to land on the moon?
Into the
Um,
thousands now between
well,
telecommunications, military, and
no. I said on Mars. I
oh,
didn't
on
say the
Mars.
Earth.
Okay.
I said it on Mars. You know, we have sent probes to Mars for a couple of decades, and some of them are orbital, and some of them are landers, and both, whatever. Um, but do you know how many? Well, let's say roughly 100 or something. I don't remember the exact number right now, and of course it changes. Um, do you know how many of them we failed to orbit or land?
Most of them.
Most of them. Yeah. Uh, I mean, there was the classic one where NASA was using let's see, I think NASA was using metric, but Jet Labs in California was using English or something. Anyway, we had the landing off by a couple thousand miles and just augured that thing right in. Next question. How many of you want to spend a minimum of 3 years on the lowest bid contract for a government vehicle?
Ugh.
You know, you can't get spare parts.
You got to be able to fix everything.
It's either got to work perfectly or you've got to know what's going to fail and take what you want with you. And then I have another question. What is the single greatest problem with nearby space exploration, such as going to Mars, or the idea that we can go to Ganymede, or Europa, or one of the moons around other planets in the solar system? Um, what is the single greatest problem in nearby space flights and activity of that nature?
Man, I don't know what's the greatest. I mean, there's cost, there's the
Well,
fuel getting
let's
there.
assume that you're willing to spend $1 trillion and you can do it. Okay. What
Yeah,
else?
'cause, well, once you have a couple trillion, then you've got real money, right?
That's right.
Um,
I can
I
think of
mean,
better things to spend it on, but
I think it's more. It becomes kind of at some point it becomes a one way trip because of the just how in the world do you refuel to get back, or if it's permanent, how do you feed people? Like how do you?
yeah,
Those would be my
and
first like 3 or 4 things.
well, and fuel is an issue. Uh, Oxygen,
Yeah,
water.
air, water. Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of problems there, but that's not the single biggest problem. Many of those problems can be overcome, including finding water on Mars,
Because there's
as
ice.
frozen ice
Yeah,
below the surface, maybe at the poles.
which you can melt and get
We
oxygen out of it. So
Well, you can get water and you can get oxygen if you've got ice that you can melt. Now, of course, the problem is that the cost to get it could be incredible as well.
mhm.
But again, we think we have found ice on the moon and in deep caves and in the polar regions of the moon. Um, so there may be ways around some of that. Okay, we can't grow crops on the soil, as the movie The Martian was very good about showing the freezing temperatures. No, the single biggest problem is radiation.
uh that was
Space is an incredibly dangerous place.
and
You,
no
you just
atmosphere
do
means
not
no
realize.
protection.
And of course, there's almost no atmosphere, very little protection whatsoever. But even 3 years in space, going back and forth, would give you 3 years of radiation. Now, why do we ground our astronauts after a certain number of hours in space? There have been people that have been up there for hundreds of days and so forth. One of the problems in launching and building the space stations like the ISS, um, the Chinese are building one, etc. One of the problems is the weight that you've got to put up there to try to shield the people so they can work in that environment.
Hmm.
Space is incredibly dangerous. And of course, you've got objects that are flying through space. You've got meteorites. Now, think about this for a second. Have you ever been to a museum where there have been craft that did go to space and come back? So, for instance, like our early Gemini's, Mercury capsules, and things like that.
I think I've only seen
Um,
replicas. I've never seen the real thing.
oh well, we have some of the real ones because uh, Grissom's capsule sank, but the others floated, and we brought them back. And you can go to the Smithsonian, and you can see a Mercury capsule, a one-man Mercury capsule, on display that's untouched. So you can bring them back, and you can put them back to what they were like originally, or you can leave them as they were. Now, a good museum would like to leave them as they were so that you can see what they were like after they were used. Because otherwise, you can build a new one. Now, I challenge you to go to a museum like the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Take a look at a Mercury capsule that was in space for a few days, or any other capsule that we retrieved, because again, they floated and we brought them back. And take a look at the glass windows. Take a look at the paint. And what you're going to realize is the paint and the glass, they're all scratched.
Mm.
Now, why? Well, there's dust particles in outer space.
Flying around with no
Now,
resistance.
yeah, more or less. And the capsules are traveling at 17,500 miles an hour. Now, what happens when you hit a particle of dust at 17,500 miles an hour? It will scratch the paint off a vessel.
Yeah.
It will scratch that thick glass that they have to use because of the pressures and so forth, right? What is the reason that you wouldn't want to go to Mars? Well, it's the radiation, because that's the short-term thing. And space is full of not only solar radiation, but galactic radiation. And it's very dangerous. X-rays, gamma rays, all kinds of stuff, ultraviolet light, infrared light. However, I do like good science fiction, but there's an awful lot of bad science fiction out there. And so let's take a look at, say, the Star Trek, Star Wars stuff that people certainly be familiar with these days. Why will we never go warp 10 across the galaxy?
Can't open up a wormhole.
Well, that's assuming that wormholes would be usable for transport. That's a science fiction concept.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm talking about the real reason. Okay. The idea that we're going to make vehicles. I mean, the fastest thing we can make today. I'm talking about today. Could say travel at 50,000 miles an hour. But the idea of going warp speed, across the universe, or sending rockets or spaceship at very high speeds, near light speed or whatever.
Yeah.
The
But
the
yeah.
limiting the,
Yeah.
the limiting factor the limiting factor is friction.
Yeah.
The whole idea that, well, we're going to put the space crew in suspended animation in these capsules. Now, again, how would you really want to go to sleep in the lowest bid capsule that's supposed to keep you alive for 1,000 years? I don't think so. It's not going to last, folks. I'm sorry. You have to remember that just to get across the Milky Way takes 150,000 light years. But let's, you want to go to the nearest star, 4.3 light years away. When you get there, you can't land and you got to come back. So you can't resupply. But the biggest thing is friction, because space is not a total vacuum.
Yeah.
As you go across through space, you're going to hit things, and things are going to hit you. And one of the big problems, we have to move the space stations around sometimes because of the rocks flying through space that we find out that coming in are going to hit it. And a little pebble, a quarter of an inch across, traveling at 17,500 miles an hour, punch a hole right through the space station.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we accelerate something to try to get somewhere in a hurry, the friction would eat through the hull before you got there. So I like good science fiction. I do. And good science fiction has been predictive of some really good science. I mean, Jules Verne's stuff with the Nautilus was really good. Now, his mission to the moon was ridiculous, but his story of the Nautilus was really predictive, wasn't it? It was really good science fiction. And there's been some other really good science fiction that has been predictive of what would happen later. But there's an awful lot of bad science fiction.
Mm. Yeah, you just have to open up a textbook. Just open up a science textbook, and there it is.
An evolutionary science textbooks is fiction from one end to the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Doc, I can't wait to have you back, but I don't want to keep you much longer. We've gone through about everything. I think maybe just leave us with a word of encouragement as to why this is important to, because I've heard this, and it's funny. I don't want to put him on the spot or put him on blast, but one of our staff pastors actually told me, he buys into the gap theory, and I was just like, our head pastor had to just kind of stop me because he could see my head like I was fomenting the arguments, because he's never had that discussion with me. And I was like, we got to talk, man. I was like, we're going to lunch and we're going to have a conversation. I was like, well, the gap. I'm like, yeah, I'm very familiar with tovu bohu. And yeah, no, man, you got to. And he even said, he's like, well, dinosaurs and man didn't live together. And I mean, I almost fell out of my chair. I almost fell
Of
out of
course
my
they
chair.
did. Of course they did, as you know.
Oh,
Um,
yes. But
but see, again, that's ignorance, which is curable. If we could get him to sit down and take a look at the Bible and science, dinosaurs are mentioned 14 times, or their relatives. They are not all dinosaurs. Some are great marine reptiles. Some are flying reptiles. But dinosaurs and their relatives, as people think of them, are mentioned 14 times in the Bible. We have more than adequate human history since the close of the Old Testament for the last 2,400 years of reliable historians, and starting with Herodotus, uh, we could go on. I mean,
yep,
Josephus
Marco
talks
Polo.
about the Marco Polo, but there's a lot of others. I mean, uh, when you take a look at literature like the epic poetries, the ancient epic poetries, Beowulf and so forth, St. George and the Dragon is a true story. It occurred about 1,700 years ago. Um, so I always like to point out that the last sighting of a live dinosaur that I am aware of in literature is cited by
1869.
an evolutionist in 1883
I
in
was.
Bolivia.
Yeah, yep.
1883 in Bolivia.
The Diplodocus by the he was a UK general or lieutenant, right? Lieutenant from the Great Britain, right? Am I
Trying to
mixing
figure
up?
out what in the world you're talking about. In 1883, a small armored dinosaur, uh, probably an
Oh, the
ankylosaur.
ankylosaur.
The ankylosaur was found in Bolivia in 1883. Um, but we have human literature, we have art, we have artifacts of people and dinosaurs living together. I mean, in Mexico, back in the area right after World War II, we found 33,500 fire clay figurines. Many of them are of dinosaurs or dinosaurs and people together, and yet, according to evolutionary believing anthropologists, these clay figures are supposed to be 1,800 to 2,800 years old. They're not just pre Columbian, they're way pre Columbian.
Hmm.
We have figurines of dinosaurs in Chinese tombs in China. Um, we don't have enough time, and I'm
Yeah.
sorry, we're going to have to stop in just a couple of minutes.
Oh yeah.
But we have
Absolutely.
art, we have literature, we have good, solid historians. We have the Bible record, which is the first and foremost of all history books, showing that people and dinosaurs lived together.
Yep.
I am writing an extensive article right now. Now, I have a video on why the gap theory is not true, which you can get right now.
Mm-hmm.
But in my monthly newsletter that I put out, and people can sign up for the monthly newsletter if they're interested at
It's great,
creationworldview.org.
y'all.
And
I got mine. I got
um,
my new one today.
well, that's good. I'm going to be putting out another one in about 3 weeks. But I've been writing an extended serial, meaning series, of what I call Bible labs on why the gap theory or any other old Earth view is not true. And when I get it finished, I will then put the whole compilation as one big article, and I will put it on the website where anybody can access it for free. But we have over 100 articles on a wide variety of subjects, including the age of the Earth, for instance, or the fossil record, or the supposed dating processes. So you can go there and you can debunk the whole thing. Excuse me. But the gap theory didn't exist until 1813. It was a compromise with evolution, trying to force
Mm.
evolutionary time, or what's called deep time, into the Bible. It's totally artificial. It's not true. It is easily disproven. First, from the science with geochronometers, which I have done many, many times. But in this article, or compilation of a series of these newsletters, it'll be an article. What I'm doing is the theological side of it. Now, why is this important? If the earth were old, then people will destroy the power of the cross because you're saying that, for instance, death of a nefesh organism occurred prior to human sin. Now, in Romans 5:12 and 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is very specific that no nefesh organism died prior to human sin. So if you believe in the gap theory, you believe in life and death before a nefesh organism came into existence, or that they died before human sin. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it. And so theologically, you cannot accept the gap theory or any other old earth view, whether it's allegory theory, framework theory, there's others, day age theory.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you accept them, whether you realize it or not, you're denying the power of the cross. Because if, as Paul said, it was the sin of the first man, Adam, that caused death to come into the universe, and the death of the second Adam, Jesus Christ, to conquer it. If that is not true, if creatures that are nefesh organisms, which means has a soul, were living and dying before Adam's sin, then human sin is not what caused death to come into the universe. And if human sin didn't cause death to come into the universe, then the death of Jesus Christ on the cross is meaningless. And we might as well turn off the TV and go home. It's not the salvation issue. The salvation issue is your relationship with the Father through the Son. That's the salvation thing. But the age of the earth issue is critical to the gospel.
Yeah.
Because it is only with a young creation that it makes any sense theologically. And if you believe in an old earth position, you're denying solid Christian theology. You're denying that human sin is the cause of death coming into the universe. And this then becomes critical. Now, again, it's not the salvation issue, but it is critical to the gospel.
Yeah. That's it. You wrapped it up with a nice bow. Doc, we love you. We appreciate you. I want to encourage everybody. I've put in links to all these great teachings that he has on his website concerning gap theory, carbon-14, the waters cleaved. They're in the comments. His website, creationworldview.org. Go over there, look around, especially if you speak, I said Brazilian and Russian.
English, English, Portuguese, or Russian.
Yep. And go over there and bless this man's ministry because he's going to Brazil later this year, and pray that the Ukrainian-Russian war ends soon so that he can go back over there and continue his work for the gospel and for the kingdom. Doc, we love you. We bless you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom, that you would be made whole in all that you do. All right. We bless you. Remember, y'all, Jesus loves you. So do we. And the just shall live by faith. Y'all peace out. Take care.